Welcome back to the American Freedoms Podcast. I'm your host, Anwar Ahmad Saleh, and on this week's episode, we will be discussing the Prohibition era of the 1920s. More specifically, how did this point in time prohibit people's freedom, and whether or not this was seen as a violation of freedom at the time. In the year 1920, the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, was put in place. The amendment was advocated for by two major groups, the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the church-affiliated Anti-Saloon League. In response to this, almost every major city saw a massive uptick in gang violence and activity. Bootleggers, as they were more commonly referred to, began smuggling in alcohol into the United States and into underground bars known as speakeasies. The leadership behind the Prohibition Act actually set it up for failure. Even though the act was passed, the government failed to budget an adequate amount of money to actually finance the implementation of the act. A Prohibition Bureau was established, though it was heavily underfunded. The goal of the Bureau was to monitor all which related to alcohol and alcohol production. This was an impossible task, as the Bureau consisted of only 1,500 poorly paid federal agents for the monitoring of an entire nation. So, essentially, the leadership of the time put Prohibition in a position to fail from the beginning. People of the time had differing reactions with how Prohibition restricted their freedom. There were those who viewed the act as a violation of their freedom, as, reeling from World War I, the people of the time returned home in hopes of enjoying themselves, not having their alcohol taken away. Although, as with every divisive issue, there were those in support of the Prohibition Act. Even with its actual legislative implementation, the act would grow to be seen as a violation of the American people's freedoms, as the amount of people in favor of the act would quickly fall to 19% by its demise. Similarly, today, we are seeing similar themes which occurred during the time of Prohibition come around again with the decriminalization of marijuana. Marijuana, at this moment, is officially categorized as a Schedule I drug by the federal United States government, although marijuana is legal in some states for medical use. Interestingly enough, our modern era has seen a massive change in the public opinion on marijuana, and as a result, some state governments have actually begun to decriminalize the drug for recreational use. States which include Colorado, Washington, and Massachusetts. Marijuana was initially categorized as a Schedule I drug by the Nixon administration, but later popularized by the Reagan administration during the war on drugs. Today, the cultural view on marijuana has changed completely. Marijuana has entered the cultural zeitgeist in a big way, taking the role of this new generation's cigarettes almost. Even with marijuana's almost universal mainstream appeal and aforementioned decriminalization in some states, marijuana, oddly enough, is still illegal at the federal level. This essentially meaning that if you were to personally possess marijuana in Colorado, the Colorado State Police would not be able to arrest you based on your marijuana possession, but the FBI would be able to, regardless of my previous statement. Marijuana has always been a popular drug, but in recent history, its popularity has skyrocketed to a new high. Marijuana's federal criminalization during the war on drugs had detrimentally disproportionate effects on low-income African Americans at the time. Marijuana, not fitting the characteristics of a Schedule I drug, was still treated as one. As such, marijuana was a much more commonly found drug among people of the time in comparison to other Schedule I drugs. African Americans were also stopped and searched more than their white counterparts, which also played a factor in this. So, as is demonstrated by this, we see that marijuana was used as a way to trample on the people's freedom and incarcerate them for a drug which does not even pose half of the threat which the government of the time claimed it to be. Today, with marijuana's popularity, marijuana is becoming increasingly seen as a right to the people. That, coupled with marijuana's legalization in other developed countries, has created a strong juxtaposition between the two eras, as marijuana was once seen as a substance comparable to that of methamphetamine, but today it is seen as something akin to a whiskey. Looking at the two situations, even though separated by more than 80 years of time, Prohibition and marijuana legalization mirror each other in the failings of their leaders. Both highlight major federal oversight. Marijuana representing a lack of federal awareness and adaptability, because now you have a situation where marijuana is and isn't legal. Similarly, with Prohibition, you had a law go into effect, but it wasn't in effect. as the Prohibition Bureau itself was unable to monitor the entire United States, and eventually underground bars, or speakeasies as aforementioned, became an open secret amongst people and police alike. As a result of marijuana's popularity, today we see this image of a stoner character being taken on by many teenagers and millennials. Slurring your words, dragging your feet, speaking slowly, being indifferent, and wearing baggy clothes are all characteristics of your typical stoner. Similarly, during the Prohibition era, there was an image of a drinker, that being a man who is drunk all hours of the day, abusing their wife, children, and is generally a bad person. When we examine alcohol's relationship with the American culture, it almost perfectly represents marijuana today with an accurate analogy. Both substances were criminalized for no real reason. The culture has come to accept both substances, even though they are technically illegal. And marijuana seems like it will soon be legal across the US, as alcohol was made legal across the US post-Prohibition. So, with this, we can say the prohibition on marijuana is coming to an end, creating the perfect analogy between both substances' journeys from social scorn to being completely okay. With that, I end this week's episode of the American Freedom Podcast. I'm Anwar Ahmad Saleh signing out.